Hey guys, Paul here with Patek. In this video, if you have a need to do green screen in a very small space like what I have, and you want your green screen to look something like this or maybe even better, the sky's the limit. That's what this video is all about. I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks that I've learned for getting good green screen in a small space. So let's check it out. So let's deal with a little bit of the housekeeping first. We're shooting green screen for 1080p. I'm shooting with a Sony a7 III Tamron 28 to 75 millimeter lens, which is what I'm shooting on now. I'm also using a 24G master lens, and my ISO is cranked up to about 1600. And if we're going to talk about green screen in a small space, probably we need a small space. So here's our small space, and before I go too much farther, the green screen that we're shooting is for 1080p. All right, so I want to be clear on that. And the specs on the camera, the settings on the camera, I'm at a 60th at f4, and my ISO is 1600. Okay, so this is my small space. 9 feet from wall to wall. So if you're working in an apartment, I mean, you can probably relate to what I'm dealing with. But this is fine for me. I do a lot of corporate green screen here, but mostly this is my headshot studio. So I have a different backdrop here. You can see the thing at the back to roll the backdrops down. That's all great. You can see just on the side here, I've got a little monitor on a cart, and that's great for seeing myself, for setting up my shots and all that kind of stuff. And then out of camera, and I'll show you this shot, there's a couple of lights up the top here. And you know, you don't really need a lot of high power light. You want to have more light on you than what you have on the background. And the one thing that I noticed, if you watch this right now, my overhead lights are off. When I set up this whole studio, the whole house, I put in daylight balanced LED bulbs. And so the screen looks a little bit dark right now. But if I just come over, and so what you can see is that this light here, if I was sitting directly, under it, I'd have big hot spots on my head. So what I did was I put a little piece of cardboard on it, and now it projects the light onto the green screen. It gives me a nice, even background. And as far as distance, the further you are away from the green screen, the better it is. So, you know, if I would say now I'm probably 4 feet or 3 feet from the green screen, but I've done this same setup where I'm like 2 feet from the green screen. The only issue you'll have is I get a little bit of reflection on the table, and you'll see it if you watch close, and it's hard to get rid of that. But the secret to being able to do green screen in a small space is the technology on the cameras has improved so much. The resolution is getting higher, and you've got a thing called ISO. You know, way back in the day, we couldn't crank up the ISO to 1600 and get a good quality video, but now it's no problem. And so that's really where we're getting started with. You know, you need a couple of lights, you need your backdrop set up properly, it has to be lighted properly, and set your ISO. Now, why f4? Because if I was shooting at f1.8 or 2.8, then if I was showing you a lens or something like that, it would be out of focus. I would be in focus, but the lens would be out of focus, which is, you know, an issue. So we want to avoid that if possible. Okay, so let's talk about your green screen background. So as you can see here, this is probably the background that I use in most of my YouTube videos. It's fairly realistic. It's a barn board with some 3 images in the back here. And this is just a composite that I put together in Photoshop. And then I duplicated it. There's another variation of it on a brick wall. And so here's an example of what I'm talking about. So first of all, what's wrong with this image? The perspective is all wrong. I mean, it's not too bad, but the background image is so low res compared to the foreground that it really just doesn't work. Now, if you want to have some fun, I mean, you can do things like this, or something like this. You might see a newscaster in front of a skyline like this, but in this particular case, it's not realistic. And this one here is just wonky, right? Like, yeah, you can do it, but why would you? So now here's one that's a little more realistic. And just to show you about perspective, let's just come up here let's go to 25%. And if I click on this image here, you can see the original image This perspective doesn't work because it looks like I'm up in a loft or something. Like, why would I would be so high compared to the background? And so that's where you have to jump in and use your good judgment as to what's going to look more realistic. Probably something like this. Come back to fit to screen here. And now you've got something that's a little more realistic. So it just looks like I've slapped a desk on the floor in the foreground, and away you go. You can get a really decent green screen effect that way. Let's cover some basic rules for recording green screen. Firstly, it's very likely that you're going to need more light on you than you think, depending on how big the sensor in your camera is. So whether you're using a webcam, you're going to need a lot of light. Or like my Sony a7 III, the sensor is a lot bigger, so you're going to need less light. And also the lens that you're using, whether you're using a prime lens that has a wide aperture like 1.8 or 1.4 compared to a kit lens, which is 3.5 to 6, something like that. So that's the first thing, is be aware of the amount of light that you're going to need. Second, the light needs to be even across the green screen. And so I gave you a good example of that when I switched on the house lights in the studio as compared to when the lights were off. Third thing we want to look at is that the subject generally needs to be lit separate if possible. So you want to have, if you can have two lights in front of you that are lighting you and then another two lights that are lighting the backdrop, similar to the way I did with the house lights or some facsimile thereof, that's the best way to go. Now, ideally, you want more light on the subject than the background, and you always want to expose for the foreground when you're getting set up. You want to avoid shadows on the background, like those caused by a wrinkled background. So get out the old iron and try and get rid of any wrinkles that you have, unless you're using like one of the Westcott backgrounds that are wrinkle resistant. Just hang them up, and usually a day later, the wrinkles are all gone out of them. Next, you want to keep the background taut to help avoid wrinkles and folds that cause shadows. So that's another little thing that'll help you out. And then probably the biggest trick or the biggest help to me has been higher ISOs. Now, higher ISOs in photography will typically add noise, which can be problematic for keying out your green screen. But because the resolution is so much greater these days, like 24 megapixels, you can crank the ISO. Like I said, I typically shoot video at 800 ISO, and this green screen stuff that I did for this video was done at 1600. So that's the thing to keep in mind when it comes to ISO. For photography, it creates noise. If you go too far, it's going to be problematic trying to key out a green screen. So, don't get too carried away. And last but not least, lower f-stops let in more light, but be aware of the effect you're going for. So, you want to use a prime lens because they let in more light. But if you're going to be showing the YouTube video that you're doing, or whatever video you're doing, if you're going to be showing products, then you want to be around 3.5, f3.5 or f4, something like that, so that everything, you've got a good depth of field and nothing is blurred out too much. Okay guys, so just to wrap this up, we've covered a ton of stuff in this video, and just so that you know, any of the videos that I do, I do them from the perspective that if I can do it, anybody can do it. So if you have questions about green screen, or you're having some issue or something like that, I mean, for crying out loud, connect in or shoot me an email at phillfx@gmail.com. Connect in the comments or ask your question in the comments. Either way, I mean, I'll get back to you. I try to get back within 24 hours. And yeah, if I can help you, I mean, why not? We're all in this together, right? And so in case I didn't mention it earlier, any of the backdrops that you saw in this video, especially the ones with the barn board, if you want to, I can send those out to you free of charge. It's no problem at all. You can use them if you're practicing your own green screen. And I'd really appreciate it if you'll subscribe and like. And actually, that's the requirement for if you want the free backdrops. You have to be a subscriber of the channel. But other than that, I think that's it for this one. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.